Hello, and welcome to this version of Let's Chat. My name is Karen Emmons, and I'm the VASO board member, one of the technology event group leaders, and a national event supervisor. I'm accompanied this evening by Dr. Andrew Skinner. Andrew is a VASO board member. Actually, he's the vice chair and an event group leader. Dr. Skinner is a physicist and a musician who plays tuba in a number of ensembles in Northern Virginia. I know he plays the piano too, and I've just learned this evening that he also plays some guitar and recorder. He's a great example of how often STEM people are also avid musicians, and Dr. Skinner has been our event supervisor for Sounds of Music for at least 4 years now. Please be aware in our time tonight that we cannot possibly cover every rule or situation in the rules or VASO clarifications. Nothing we say here today supersedes a rule or a clarification. This session does not replace reading the rules. So read the rules often, because every time you do, you'll see something else, and then read them again. And don't forget about the VASO clarifications on the website, which are as binding as rules. I know that we have a lot of parents on this call. Please remember that Science Olympiad is a hands-on activity for students and a hands-off activity for parents. Students must build all parts of the instrument that they bring to the tournament, but parents can and should teach tool skill and safety. They can help students think about what should go in the practice log, and parents should definitely help package up the devices for safely bringing them to tournament. As we get going, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them to make sure that they get to Dr. Skinner. This is being recorded, will be posted on our YouTube channel and on the appropriate event page of our website. So I'm going to ask you to Andrew, can you turn your video back on? All right, let me add a spotlight. So again, welcome and thank you, Dr. Skinner. So Sounds of Music.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for that warm introduction. Please just call me Andrew. That's fine.
All right. So what is the task of Sounds
The
of
task
Music?
at hand. This is an event that is dear to my heart. If I was at an elementary school or middle school or high school, I would have picked this event out of all the events possible in Science Olympiad. So it's if you enjoy music, if you like learning about musical instruments, acoustics, the physics or engineering behind music and notes and things like that, this is the event for you. It really is two parts. One part is the standard VASO written test, and I'm really probably not going to spend a lot of time on the written test, other than it's worth about 45% of the marks. And again, I'm not going to go over all the sections of the written test, just to say there are 5 different sections. Some of them cover acoustics, some of them cover the how musical instruments work and the physics behind that, and some are some questions on musical theory. So I'm really not going to go into those details, as Karen has mentioned multiple times, and I will probably mention through this talk, is that read the rules many times and frequently. I read the rules a couple of months ago and thought I understood them, and I read them again just a week or so again and got a different idea of what the rules were like. So please read them frequently. Every time you read them, you'll get a new gem of an idea. So those are so one part is the written test. The second part is actually building one musical instrument, and that's the exciting part. That's the fun part. If you're a musician, actually having to make a musical instrument is you think it's easy, and then you realize it's much harder to build a musical instrument and make sure it's in tune. And over the last 4 years, I've had the joy of seeing lots of teams and students make musical instruments, everything from guitars, cellos, zithers, xylophones, glockenspiels, and a lot of them have worked absolutely beautifully. They haven't been using expensive material. The critical thing is to design something that is in tune. You can use many different materials for that. So,
all right. So I'm gonna break in for a moment and say that even though there are 2 parts of this event, that the written test happens on written test day, The device testing will happen in a different day on the hands-on day, but it needs to be the same 2 students that are doing both parts of the test, right? So same 2 students doing the written test as do the hands-on. I know you're not going to spend a lot of time, but do you want to tell us where we can find a few, do you have any tips around the written test that you'd like to highlight for us?
Let me just share my screen if I may. So let me just share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? I've gone to the Virginia Science Olympiad site. And the easiest way to find information about the events that you're involved with, if you go to middle and high school, the navigation link here, and go halfway down to the events page, that will take you to the events page. And if you scroll down a little, you'll find all the listing of the various events in different divisions, and you can pick the division. So we're in Division B, that's what Sound of Music is. So if I scroll down to the bottom here, we will have Sounds of Music, and that will take you to the Sounds of Music page. Let me just minimize that a little. And this is where you can get lots of information, useful information. I'll come back to clarifications in a minute, but it gives you some basic resources. One of the resources which I'll talk about later is the allowed range for musical instruments. And it also talk about the note numbering for the chromatic scale, which is important. But if you look below here, we have several links to other pages which are very useful. Certainly Sounds of Music, because we're dealing with musical notes and waves and things like that. There will be questions about waves, the physics of waves or engineering of waves. And certainly another page where is a great resource is the VASO Crave the Wave page, because there is a lot of useful guidelines there. I mean, I would certainly also go to the National Science Olympiad site, because there are different wiki pages or knowledge pages which students have put together to talk about the events and talk about questions and talk about things relating to building instruments or doing the test. So there's lots of good information there. But here are some of the resources that you can find regarding Sounds of Music. There are
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Karen, go ahead.
So that's great. And the Crave the Wave page actually has a little series of teaching videos. So there's actually like 3 teaching videos about waves that are very useful, and you can find them. You can go straight to Crave the Wave, or you can go to Sounds of Music. So let's move on then to what are the highlights of the events of the instrument that you have to build this year.
Okay, so as I say, I mentioned the test is about 45%. The rest of the event, 55%, is actually building and playing your musical instrument. It's not just playing it, building it. You actually have to demonstrate it in a couple of different ways. One way is you have to build the instrument so the notes are a particular pitch, and you're sort of measured how close you are to the exact pitch. That's worth about 25% of the marks. You'll notice there is also in the rules, there is a song score, which is worth about 20% of the marks. This is where you will actually get to play your instrument. So the songs that you are required to play also vary depending whether you're at an invitational, a regional, states, or national level. But they're worth about 20% of the marks, and we'll go to those in more detail. And then there's a log, which is worth about 10%. And you're required to have 2 copies of the log, one for yourself if you need to use it for setting up your instrument, or if it's got references to the music or anything like that, and also one for the event supervisor. The copy you give to the event supervisor, the event supervisor will not be giving back. They'll be reviewing it, and that will be including as part of the sort of team entry. So it's important to have 2 copies of the log. A lot of teams forget about the log, and that's 10%, which you can very easily, 10% of the marks, which you can get very easily by just producing a log which meets the criteria in the rules. And the rules are very explicit as to what the log should include. And again, I won't go into a lot of detail with that, but again, it's worth 10% of the mark. So it's not small change. So I would encourage all the teams to put a log together and actually use it. I mean, I've seen many teams in the past who either have forgotten to bring a log, so they've already lost 10% of the possible marks they could get, or it's incomplete, or they put the log together the night before, or even a couple of hours before the event. So it's not as good as they could do. And certainly, you know, I think all teams, if they kind of sat down, look at the rules and know their instruments, they could easily put a log together, which will get the full marks for 10%. So.
Great, thank you. So that's roughly how it's scored. Let's focus in then on the construction parameters for a minute. So what are some of the changes? So this was an event in Division B last year, and there are a number of changes this year. So what are the changes that are big this year?
Okay, so one of the most fundamental changes is that your instrument needs to be able to play a 12-note chromatic scale. From over a 1 octave. In previous years, it was like a major scale. This year, you have to your instrument has to be able to do a 12-note chromatic scale. And when we do the pitch test, you won't be necessarily judged on every single note of that chromatic scale. I'm going to bring up one of the exhibits now. So here's again, this is on the Vaso Sounds of Music site. So if I click this, it brings up a nice image of a piano keyboard, and it's showing you the chromatic scale starting on middle C and going up to the following C. And as you can see, there are, excluding the octave, the C which is repeated, there are 12 notes in the chromatic scale. And so your instrument, when you have to build it, needs to be able to play those 12 notes, because you're going to need those 12 notes in different combinations to be able to play the different songs. Again, they're different for invitational, regional, and states and nationals. And also, when we measure the pitch, we're not measuring the pitch for all 12 notes. And you won't know coming into the event what those notes will be. So one thing is building the instrument so it can play a chromatic scale, and then you'll be judged not on the whole chromatic scale, but 8 notes of that chromatic scale, and those will be decided on the event day by the event supervisor, but they will be the same for all teams. So again, the important thing, I would encourage teams, you know, you can pick whatever the starting note is, but I would certainly make it easy for the event supervisor and yourself to at least number your notes in whatever, you know, chromatic scale that you choose. It could start on C, it could start on A, it could start on A flat, any note that you wish, which makes sense for your instruments. But I would at least number the notes in a similar way to what you're seeing here, so that, you know, when the supervisor says he or she wants you to play notes 1, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, you know which notes those are going to be, because I'm probably not I'm not going to necessarily know what your starting note is going to be. So I'm probably going to just tell you by the number, the degree on the chromatic scale. So that's one big important change.
Can I ask you a question about the chromatic scale though?
Yeah.
I think you need the octave though, don't you, to be able to play the songs?
Yes,
so you actually need all 13 notes of the chromatic.
Yes.
It's just for pitch testing, you'll only be judged on, you'll be judged on 1 for sure, because it's the rules say 1 and then 7 others, right?
Yes, okay. Yes, that is perfectly correct. But you will need all 13 notes to play your song, to play each of the songs at the different at the different levels. The second big change that we've already mentioned a couple of times, in previous years you just had to play 1 song and it didn't change for whatever tournament you were at. The interesting thing with this year, let me just close this exhibit and just go to the rules, because the rules actually have a listing of of some of the songs which are involved. So if you go right to the bottom here, the song for the invitationals is Amazing Grace. Could everybody see this okay, by the way?
Yes.
Maybe a bit too big. So for invitational, the song is Amazing Grace. For regionals, it's O Susanna. And for the state tournaments, it's actually it's to be determined. The nationals are probably going to change this song, but it will still be within an octave, right? So, and that will be announced way before the state tournament. So again, you can still build your instrument. It has to be a chromatic scale for a whole octave, and you can pick any starting note within a certain range. We will know what the state song will be probably over the next couple of months, but nationals are determining a different one for than the one that's actually printed here.
Why are they changing it, Andrew?
Because it goes over the octave range. If you notice, if you look at actually this song, if you built an instrument which only had a chromatic scale for an octave, this actually goes higher than an octave. So it starts at E here, but it goes to a G just above the stave here. So it actually goes over an octave a bit. So that's the main reason why they're changing it. They wanted all the instruments to be, all the songs to be within with at most an octave. So your instrument, it just has to be built to be played for the octaves. The second change, besides playing the song, is, I mean, you can play these songs on your instrument nice and straight. You can play them without any emotion or feeling or any. You can just play them at the same level. That would have been fine for last year's rules. This year's rules, you can still do that, but you can actually get extra marks for what is called including embellishments. And if you look at the rules here at the top, they give you some examples of the embellishments, which include mordants, slurs, turns, fermatas, and grace notes. So these sound very technical musical terms. I can give you some examples now. Not all of, but they also list things which are not necessarily included. There are things which are not necessarily listed here, which are also included. So if you look at Amazing Grace for an invitational, the embellishments are actually marked with this number. So the first number here is expecting a crescendo of sound. So you'd start off with mezzo forte, and then you get louder and go up to a 40. The second embellishment is a tie. So your note kind of carries over to the next measure. The third embellishment is a diminuendo, where your sound is decreasing in quality. Your fourth embellishment is what is called a mordant, which is not a very typical embellishment that people would see, and I will go back to that in a minute. And the fifth embellishment here is what is called a fermata, which from a musician's perspective, that just means your note is sustained a little longer than the actual value that is written here. So this G, you normally play just for 3 beats. With the fermata, it just tells you to play it a bit longer, typically half as long again. And so again, when you're playing the song, you are going to be judged on pitch, you're going to be judged on rhythm, and also you can get extra marks for playing these embellishments as well. One thing I wanted, seeing as a couple of these examples have a mordant, and I don't think that's very familiar to most people. And you see there's this little squiggly line here, which is called a mordant. If you look it up and just do a Google search, you can find out what it is. But there are 2 types of mordant. One mordant means you kind of start at a note and then go up a note and come back down. That's the type of mordant you have here. You can also have a mordant which just has a line through it, which means you start at the given note and then you go down a note and come back up. So, I mean, just to give you an example, I've got a recorder here, and if I play the B, if I go up a note, it would be a mordant would sound something like this.
We're not picking up the recorder, Andrew.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Could you just sing it for us?
It would go da 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 da. Or it would go up a note and then come back again, or it would go, if it's got a slash through it, it just means instead of going up, you go down, and you're playing it very fast. So one would go da da da, going up, and one would go down. So again, mordant is probably not familiar necessarily to lots of people. Those seem to be at least for invitational regionals. I don't know what the replacement song will be for the States, but as you see in this example, it doesn't have anything other than the mordants, diminuendos, and fermatas and things. So they could include other things. But again, for the state tournament, they will publish that, so you should know that beforehand. But this little squiggly thing is called a mordant. So I would certainly look it up so that you know how to play it.
Are they? Does it go up within the key or does it go up a half step in a mordent?
It usually goes within up in the key, whatever
Up in the key.
yeah,
Okay,
whatever-
great, thank you.
Yeah, so whatever key you're playing. So for the example, for the Amazing Grace, here we're in the key of G. So this would go from B to C and back to B. If it had a slash through it, it would go from B to A and back to B again. It's in whatever key that you're playing. So
Okay, great, thank you.
So what other changes? I think we've covered all the major changes for this tournament. Have I missed anything, Karen?
No, I think you've got that. So let's talk about just some of the very basic construction parameters. What can, size, what can they use? Those sorts of questions to build the instruments.
So one critical thing is the size of the instrument. So the instrument has to fit in a box 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters by 100 centimeters, and that's the starting configuration. So you could have your instrument fit into that size, and then when you bring it on the day, you could it could expand to be something bigger, but it has to be fit within that initial size. And the event supervisor, like myself, one of the first things we're going to do is measure the size of the instrument when you bring it through the door. But does it fit within that virtual box? And if it does fit in the box, that's good. If it doesn't, or it's slightly out, then that would be a construction violation. The second important thing, it has to the actual instrument has to be within a certain range. You can't just pick any notes. If you look at the rules, the starting note for your chromatic scale, I think, has to be from F2 to C4.
Do you want to show us the exhibit for that?
That would be that. Thank you for reminding. That's really great. Yes, let me do that. So
I stopped your screen share, so you're gonna have to bring it back up. Sorry.
That's fine.
People can see you.
Let me do my screen share again. Okay. Okay. So the second exhibit is, again, we're back on the Sounds of Music site, and there's the allowed range. So if you kind of click on this, it tells you, how all the notes are numbered. It gives you examples of different C's on the piano and different B's, but the starting note for your instrument has to be in the range F2 to C4. So C4 is middle C. And again, this is the starting note. So if you chose to be at the upper end and you picked middle C as your starting note for your instrument, then your chromatic scale would go from C4 to C5. If you started at the bottom end, then you'd start from the F2, which is just here, and you'd be going from F2 to F3. So this is actually a big change. I mean, previous years, you actually had a much wider a much wider range of starting notes. Here you have maybe just over, nearly 2 octaves or whatever. So that means your instruments are probably going to be a bit bigger than they were on previous years. So again, to be very careful, because I mean, the critical thing is, I mean, you could build an instrument which sound absolutely beautiful, and it was from, kind of C5 to C6, and most of your notes would be outside of the allowed range. Perhaps only the C5 would be the only allowed notes that would actually get a score. So again, be very careful when you're building instruments that the starting note for your chromatic scale is within this range, F2 to C4. If it's outside it, you may get some note, like if you picked C2, perhaps C2 up to E2 wouldn't be scored, and then the latter part of the chromatic scale would get some marks. So if you're starting notes outside this range, it means you're automatically going to reduce your score. So if you want to maximize your score, you need to have your instrument with the starting notes within this range from F2 to C4. Okay. Other things, what materials can you build the instrument? You can pretty much build it out of, anything. And it doesn't have to be expensive. So, I mean, I sort of look at it, things that are at your hobby shop, things that are at Office Depot, things that you recycled things that you have. I've seen really good instruments made out of lots of different things around the house. The critical thing is being able to tune it and being able to accurately tune it on the day of the event. So I mean, some people have brought glasses filled with water, and the level of the water changes the notes. I mean, you have to be careful that you can. Again, anything that you bring for your musical instrument has to fit in the 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters by 100 waters. You can't just have your instruments and then a whole lot of other things that you're bringing to support the instrument. Everything that is part of the instrument has to fit within that size. You can one thing that you're not allowed typically to use is anything from a professional or a toy musical instrument. So if you have a toy musical instrument, say a mouthpiece, or perhaps it's a mallet or a hammer from a percussion instrument, you can't use those as part of your instrument. You need to make your own mallets or your own mouthpieces. The one exception is for string. If you were going to build a violin or a guitar, you are allowed to use commercial strings and commercial rosin. That's the only exception. So in previous years, I've seen, and the other thing is, like if you're building the guitar, it's always tempting to just use a commercial pick, for your guitar. You could easily, change your commercial pick and use a quarter or something like that, or some other hard substance to pluck your strings. But again, the important thing is you cannot use any professional or toy instruments or any electrical instruments.
Let me break in here and ask a question about that. So when you say professional, you don't mean professional level like somebody in an orchestra you use. You mean anything commercial, right?
Yes, commercial, something you would buy as a musical instrument. But
so you can't just say it's a student mouthpiece. It's not a professional mouth. Anything that's commercial is even really off limits.
Yeah. So what we've seen in previous years is sometimes people will bring they'll build a beautiful xylophone or glockenspiel, and then they'll bring a professional mallet, from school to hit it. I mean, you can easily make mallets in many different ways, not very expensively, but you cannot use. I mean, one of the questions I would ask is, how did you make that mallet? And if the students say, well, I just, took it from my, my school music closet, then, that would be part of a musical instrument. Some sort of instruments to start a sound wave up actually use flip-flops, because they hit the top of an open PVC pipe, and flip-flops tend to be very good at making a nice contact and initiating a sound wave and getting a very clear sound. I mean, that's not a professional commercial mallet or things to hit it with, but again, you have to be very careful that you're not using anything that is commercial, that or recycling an old musical instrument, or recycling a toy that you had at elementary school or something like that. So as I say, the main exception is strings for musical instruments, and you can use commercial rosin. So if you're a string player or a guitar player and you're wanting to build your own guitar, you could build a violin or a guitar out of plywood, create a sound box, and you don't have to replace your strings. You can use commercial strings for that. Okay. The other thing is 3D printing.
Actually, before you move on to that, so I wanted to refresh, because this is going by. There's so much information. So just and Andrew did say this, but I wanted to say it again. So no electric or no electronic components. We also need to talk about, I think, in terms of the stored energy, right?
Right. So on previous years, you weren't allowed to store energy for your musical instrument. There is actually
what does that mean?
So I mean, so if you decided to store some wind, some air in a bag, and then deflate that at a later date to sort of play a musical instrument. In previous years, that wouldn't be allowed. This year, you cannot do that when you walk into the event, but if you if I mean, the example would be is if you decided to build a bagpipes, right? So a bagpipe has a bag which you can inflate. If you inflated it prior to coming into the event, that would not be allowed. But if it's deflated and then you inflate it while you're actually playing the instrument, that is fine, right? So so again, the differences between, you know, whether you kind of, you know, pre-inflated it prior to the event, or whether it's, you know, it started off in a deflated state and then you inflated it as part of playing your instrument. That would, so that is allowed this year. So again, but it can't be stored prior to the event. So
I also wanted to highlight one other thing about construction issues, and then yes, let's move on to 3D printing. Two things. So first of all, in this event, what is the penalty if you have a construction penalty?
Unfortunately, it's very high. It's 0. You basically get no marks. So
no marks for the instrument.
Right. So you could still get marks for the written test. But, you know, so it's really important to pay attention to the construction rules. So basically, building an instrument which is initial size is within 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters by 100 centimeters. And again, I wouldn't build it up to the line. If it's very close, sometimes, you know, when you bring any engineering device to a tournament, sometimes it gets jiggled in the car or moves, and, you know, it can get out of spec. So you want to make sure that you're within that spec and that you haven't built it right up to the line. Again, not using any commercial musical products except for strings and resins. And then the last thing is certainly on 3D printing. We do not want you printing your musical instruments, right? You know, you could print a recorder. You could print all the components of a recorder. If you were going to do that, you would need to design that from scratch. You could not sort of just use somebody else's design, which is on the internet, and download it and then print it all out, all the different components in your 3D printing. We're not too worried. We do want to know if you're using a 3D printer. We've seen in previous events people using 3D printers for relatively minor things like fasteners or supports or things like that. Or I'm not too worried about that. I would like to know about them, and certainly that should be part of your design log. And if you look at the rules, we request that information be put in. But again, the aim is not to use somebody else's design. You need to come up with your own design. And if you're going to, and people have used, I mean, typically on regional and state and invitational tournaments, I've seen people use 3D printers for smaller components and things that help their instrument design, but they're not a major component of the design. But again, if you are going to use a 3D printer, you also need to tell us explicitly how you use it and how did you come up with the design, as opposed to just downloading a design from somebody else. So again, the important thing is you need to build it yourself and you need to design it yourself, right?
And there is, when you all take a look at the rules, there is a section in the rules about what to do, you know, about the information that you should be including if you do use any digital fabrication. So. Right. Now, before we move on from the nuts and bolts of the construction, do we have any questions on those parameters, since they are so critical? I'm also going to just make a note here. I think you said that, you know, if you were to have a construction penalty, yes, you score 0 for the instrument, but you can also score for the log. So you would still get the log and you would still get the written test. But, you know, none of us want that, right? Yes. So this is why constructing carefully is important. All right, I don't see any questions. So let's talk about, I mean, so much of the score is around how well your notes are tuned. And that's, having had a child of my own participate in this event, I remember that was like the trickiest thing. You know, all kinds of things produce sounds, and but how to actually get the right pitches and the adjustments to make and things like that.
So let me share my screen. Let me share my screen again, and I'm going to show you the actual software that we use to measure pitch. Right. So again, if you go to the Sounds of Music website, you all have access to this pitch tester just like I do. So so if you click this link which says Sound of Music Tournament pitch tester, it comes up with this software. You can either use it over the internet. I prefer actually downloading and using a standalone copy, just because then I don't have to be dependent on having being on a network or having the internet. So that's my preference. And this is set up by Science Olympiad. So it's being built and set up specifically for this event. And as you can see, it's actually the first thing you need to do is you need to specify your starting note. Now, this is really important. Again, the event supervisor cannot prompt the teams and the students to tell them what their starting note is. You have to come into the event and say, I'm going to start with C3, perhaps. And my instrument's built around the scale going from C3 to C4. And as you can see that, just by picking the tonic is just another word for your starting note, for your chromatic. It automatically fills in all the notes for the chromatic scale starting on C3 and going up to C4. But I don't have to pick C. I could pick, perhaps if I pick E2. E2 is typically what you'd start with like if you were trying to mimic a guitar, the lowest note on a guitar string is E2. And you can see if I do that, there's automatically one note which is not scored. This first note, E2, is outside the range. I mean, we said the range was from F2 to C4, so you're automatically reducing your score if you're trying to sort of mimic the guitar strings on mimic the guitar strings. So how does this work? I mean, as an event supervisor, when you come into the event, and we'll get into the more detail of operationally what happens during the actual event, I will ask you for the starting note. It can't be the student comes up and says, well, I'm not sure what the student's starting note is. Can we tune it and work it out, and then I'll give it to you. They really have to know. We can't prompt them. If they tell us it's E2 and it's really an octave higher, E3, then we're going to go with what the student has told us, right? And then for all the teams, I'm going to give the same. The starting note would be the initial note of the chromatic scale. Then I'm going to pick 7 other notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7. And those would be the 8 notes that the student would be judged on. And again, the student is not going to know those until they actually walk in the event. The 8 notes that they're going to be judged on will be the same for every team. So the eight notes that each team will be judged on will be exactly the same notes. The starting note there'll be the same positions in the chromatic scale. Depending on how you build your instrument, you may build it with a different starting note, but it will be the same positions in the chromatic scale for all the teams, and they will only know that when they walk into the event. These will not be posted prior to the event or published on the day of the tournament, but when they go in, so they need to be prepared to deal with any combination. They know the starting note will always be the first note of the chromatic scale, and then the next 7 notes could be any combination. So again, and I'm probably just going to label them, say, I'd like you to play the first note, the 3rd note, the 5th note, the 6th note, 7th note, 8th note, 10th note, and 12th note of the chromatic scale. Because I'm not going to tell them necessarily the actual notes. I'm just going to tell them the positions. That's why I would certainly encourage them both to label their instruments, the notes on their instruments, both by the actual musical notes, E2, F2, F sharp 2, but also by the position. So it's easy for them to work out which notes that I'm wanting them to play.
They could also put that in their log, right? Because they'll
Right.
have their own copy of their log in front of them as well too. So they can refer to that when you give them the position number that they need to know.
Yeah, and to give you an example, like if the recorder I have, which you can't hear, but I can show you an example of that. The recorder is a pretty high instrument. So if I pick C4 here, the bottom note of my recorder is actually the C5 right up here. So if I was going to pick this note, let me just clear the results. I pick.
Oh, it's not going to let you, I think.
Let me just try this again. So it's. I'm going to have to clear this.
I think it holds it stable for the situ, for the whole tournament. So you may have to just restart the pitch tester.
Yeah, let me just, so I'm going to go to C4, and I'm going to pick C5. And if I was, and again, you can use this tool. This is the tool that we will be using in the test. So I would encourage, this is the tool that to use when you're testing your pitch of your musical instrument. So if I was going to test the C5, I can click the C5 here. I can say begin test, and I can say, well, this is the one I want to actually try. You're probably not going to hear this, but if I play C5 on the recorder, you can see that it actually was pretty close. It was instead of 523 hertz, it's 528 hertz, and it's 18 cents off. So again, this is how I will be measuring the pitch of your instrument, and you can use exactly the same tool, right? So the only other difference will be during the event, I will probably be using a directional microphone. So it won't just be like the microphone on a laptop, which is sort of listening to the sound all around the laptop. We will have a directional mic, which we will allow the students and teams to put in any position that they think is advantageous for their instrument. But we will be using a directional mic to pick up the sound from their instrument. But again, the process, but this is the tool, will be the tool that we'll be using. I mean, certainly if you use the tuner on your phone, that is great. But again, it may give you a false sense of security from the point of view, the tuning may be slightly different if you're using this pitch tool, or it may pick it up in a slightly different way. So I would certainly encourage you to use this pitch tool, as this is the pitch tool that we'll be using during the event.
I'd actually like to make a stronger statement even, Andrew, about this pitch tool. So one of the things that's unique about the rules of sounds of music, as I understand it, is that the pitch tester, which seems to be checking the pitch of my voice at the moment, the pitch tester wants to, the students are judged on the average pitch over 3 seconds, right? They produce the pitch for 3 seconds. So any kind of tuner you use on your phone, and that's great for an initial thing to figure out, am I playing C4, am I playing C3, am I playing C5, is not an average over time. It's just that second. And one of the things that musicians well know is that it's very hard to hold pitch stable. Yes. So because pitch, so whatever you're showing on your phone tuner, and these are all great little tools, but when you're really checking, you want to use the same one, because nothing out there gives an average that I've seen very well, except for this pitch tuner. So, or this tester, so this is why it's really important, because this is the average, and that'll tell you a lot more than just your hand one.
So certainly when you're playing an instrument, if you're blowing or buzzing into an instrument, you need to be able to sustain the note for at least 3 seconds. If you're playing a violin, you need to be able to bow and sustain the note and steady the note over 3 seconds. If you're a glockenspiel or a xylophone and you're hitting the either the metal bars or the wooden bars with a mallet, you may need to hit them a couple of times to have the note sustained. Again, you're going to have to judge what is the best approach for whatever instrument you build. Whether it's a wind instrument, whether it's a string instrument, whether it's a percussive instrument. You're going to have to work out what is the best way to get the best note to sound. And again, this is the tool that we're using, and it averages the pitch over that 3-second interval. So again,
let's talk about percussion instruments for a second, because they are a unique one in the fact that the sound may not resonate for the full 3 seconds to get that 3-second average, and whether you have to strike. So one of the experiences I've seen, and maybe you've seen this too, Andrew, is that striking the instrument can have its own kind of, you have to judge whether you want to keep striking it, and is that the right thing to do, or do you want to strike it once pretty loudly and let it resonate? Because striking can often make a very different
Yes.
pitch or a different
Yes.
sound or effect or something.
So sometimes, like if you're hitting a xylophone, so that has metal bars. If you hit it with a mallet, it actually it sets off not just the fundamental frequency, but it will actually start off some of the higher harmonics. So sometimes you may actually just want to hit it once and let the higher harmonics die out, and then have the fundamental note sort of come through as the thing that you're measuring. So again, depending what your instrument is, you're going to have to work out the approach to get to have the best value to judge your pitch for each of your notes. And that could be a different approach depending whether it's a percussive instrument versus a woodwind. With a woodwind instrument, as Karen mentioned, sometimes when you blow into it, your attack can be different. You know, you blow an instrument and perhaps it's slightly higher in pitch, and then it settles down to a lower pitch, or perhaps it settles up to a higher pitch, depending on where you are in the range. So again, you have to know your instrument that you're building and play it, and know what your instrument will do. Will it, you know, if you're sustaining the note, will it go down, you know, or will it go up? Or if you're hitting it with a mallet, what is it the best approach to hit it a couple of times to keep the fundamental going, or is it better to just hit it once and let some of the higher harmonics die out so that the fundamental kind of comes through? So, but again,
So
you will need to work that out for your instrument. We can't tell you for your instrument. You're going to have to work that out. So
it all depends on what you build it out of. And in fact, you have to be careful with making sure that parts of your instrument aren't vibrating that you don't mean to be vibrating, right? I've seen that too in like percussive instruments where they've got things are held together by bolts and rubber bands or parts that are going to vibrate and produce their own harmonics or their own tones. So you have to be careful that you don't have a lot of vibrating pieces.
And sometimes you can have supports which actually deaden the sound so that you don't get a nice clear sound. So I mean, the aim is to get a nice clear fundamental sound so that your pitch is nicely recorded and averaged. Anything which stops you doing that, which, you know, sometimes we hear very dull sounds which the microphone can't pick up. It can't tell whether it's a real note or whether it's you know, it's a note spread out over several notes. So again, the aim is to get a clear resonant note that can be picked up and can be averaged clearly. And again, you know, as in the rule, if the note is not loud enough for the microphone to pick up, or not loud enough, or the waveform is not distinguished enough to be able to identify it as a note, we can't do anything about that, right? I mean, we score it based on the pitch tool, and if it can't pick it up or it can't recognize it as a note because it's too dull, or it doesn't have a clear enough waveform to recognize it as a note, that would get 0 marks for that note.
We have a question says, you know, if we make a xylophone, that means you can strike it multiple times. And so I think we've answered, I think you've probably heard that answer. Yes, you can. And you just have to decide on your instrument whether that's the best thing, and use the pitch tool and try it both ways. Right. And see whether it's better to keep striking it, or whether it's better to hit it once and let the sound resonate. And which one produces a better sound?
I've seen it work both ways. So it can be very dependent on how you build it. So and the thing is to measure it and try it yourself with the pitch tool, right? See which one gives you the best result, or the most consistent result. You want consistency, don't you? Well, you want to know that, you know, when you tested it at home, you're going to get exactly the same result when you test it in the event. So you're looking for a consistent pitch and a consistent result. And again, I've seen both, especially for percussion instruments, I've seen it work both ways. So
staying on the topic of percussion instruments, one of the things that I'm familiar with in the building of them is the difficulty in deciding how, if you're going to have pipes and what, you know, it's the length of the pipe, right? The length of the pipe that influences the pitch primarily, but how do you mount it? So we helped, my husband and I helped and mentored a kid building a xylophone once. And so you need to think, if you mount it in a certain way, you might be changing the pitch. Do you mount it with string? Do you mount it, on both ends? So these are the kinds of questions and the things that you have to experiment with. Right. Somebody's asked a question, because the first test is virtual, will there still be a portion for the instruments to be played? So you're conflating two things. I'm gonna address that one. There is a written test day, and the portion of the event that is the written test only will happen on written test day. But then the students who participated, will also, on the hands-on day where the team actually comes in person, will do the hands-on playing of the instrument.
And this is for invitational and regionals?
No, we're talking about regionals. I don't know. I'm assuming that the question you're asking, Luke, is about regionals. A couple of other little hints. Wind instruments, something I noticed once, and maybe you've seen this too, Andrew. Kids who don't practice holding the pitch for 3 seconds and are not experienced wind, I've seen kids get dizzy. Have you ever seen that too, Andrew?
Yes, they kind of, although they don't take a big enough breath, and
so they need to practice actually holding, playing a whole bunch of notes in a row where they hold the pitch for 3 seconds. 3 seconds doesn't seem like very long, but there are some wind instruments that require like a lot of pressure to make the sound. The equivalent in real instruments would be like an oboe. Yeah. And I remember when my daughter first started playing oboe, she'd get like little headaches and have to worry about, because she didn't know how to control the air and the pressure and get the right amount of pressure. So I would encourage practicing that too, so we don't have any kids getting really, really dizzy.
Right. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Do we have any other questions, or shall we go on to perhaps what do some of the people get wrong?
Yeah, let's talk about where people go wrong with this.
Okay, so again, my apologies. Karen said this, I've said this multiple times. We're going to say it again. Read the rules multiple times. Don't just read them once. Don't use last year's rules, right? Last year's rules, this year's rules are completely different. And also if you want to see the changes between the two different years, anything which is sort of bolded in this year's rules are basically changes or new things. Please use the right set of rules, read them frequently. I'm probably going to read them at least once a week, probably all the way up to the tournament. So just to make sure I know the rules like the back of my hand, and also when I'm writing the test. The next thing, we saw this multiple times in regionals and states, people just building something which is too big. It doesn't fit. Its initial state fits outside the 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters by 100 centimeters. Now, it doesn't have to be flat. It doesn't have to be horizontal. It could be a diagonal within that space. Like if you're building a recorder or a flute or a panpipe, it doesn't have to lie down horizontal in the box in that space. It could be on a diagonal, which would give you more space. But again, your instrument has to, your initial state of your instrument has to fit within that size. If it does not, then it's automatically a construction and violation. And however good your instrument is, however good the pitch is, you would get essentially 0 marks for the pitch and playing the tunes part of the test.
So let's just reiterate around that. So you're talking about the initial state. So that's like pretend you brought it in a box, and maybe the easiest thing is to bring it in a box. And I know you're going to talk about what happens on tournament day, but they do get a little bit of time to set it up. So it can set up to bigger than that. Yeah. It just has to come in the door.
Yeah. So sometimes people bring a like a xylophone or glockenspiel, and it's already set up and it's already beautifully set up and it fits in within that space, and that's great. Sometimes people will bring all the different components and then they will assemble it after they've come into the event. And the actual components all fit within the space, but when it's assembled, it's actually bigger than that 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters by 100 centimeters. So last year, we probably saw at least 3, 4, 5 teams that built something which was too big, right?
Very disappointing.
Which is disappointing, because you want to, we will still test the instruments, we will still we still want to hear the songs, but you probably won't get any marks for them, right? So we will still go through the event, but we will say up front, I mean, we want to hear your instruments. We'll test it as best as we can, but if it has a construction violation, then it's automatically there's 0 marks for the instrument. One other very silly thing is sometimes people forgot to bring the music with them last year. So, part of the event last year was playing a musical tune. The event supervisor is not meant to give the teams anything, right? They're meant to bring everything they need through the door in the event. They bring the musical instrument, they bring their log. If they need their log because it has a copy of the music or it's notated so they can play it properly. We don't expect people to memorize it, but also I can't give them a copy of the rules or a copy of the music. They have to bring that with them. So if they don't, either they've memorized it or they're going to have to work it out themselves, right?
Well, and actually, I'm gonna stop you now because you and I were talking earlier. If the copy of the music in the rules is not necessarily the right music, and why is that, Andrew?
That's a good point, because we didn't explicitly say that anyway. Let me bring the rules back up and share my screen, because it will make sense when I bring them up. So let me just share my screen again. So thank you for reminding.
While you're doing that, Sharon Dykoff asks if there is a time limit for setup. I think it's 2 minutes to assemble. So they can't spend forever doing it.
Yeah. So I'm just going to use can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm just going to use the 2 examples that we have here for the invitational and the regional tournaments, because we know the state one is going to change anyway. So that's not relevant for this one. So I'm going to start with the easier one, which is maybe the regional one. So the regional song is O Susanna, and it starts on middle C and it goes up to the C an octave higher. So this whole song stays within the octave. It starts with C and finishes with C an octave higher. Now, if you look at Amazing Grace doesn't actually start on C, it's in a different key here. So, but if you actually transpose this, if you move everything down a whole note, so if you move this D down to C and you move the G down to an F, you're essentially moving it from the key of G to the key of F, which has 1 flat. But you would have to transpose, if you choose your musical instrument to be starting on C4 and going up to C5, then to play Amazing Grace in that same interval, you would need to transpose Amazing Grace here down 1 whole note. So the first note starts on a C. And again, 1 sharp is a key of G. If you were going to transpose it down a whole tone, then you're essentially transposing it from G to F, and F has just 1 flat. So again, the implication here is if you're going to play both of these tunes on the one instrument that is in 1 octave, has 1 chromatic octave, you can do that, but you have to transpose one of these pieces so that they also start on if C was your starting note. It could be the other way around. Perhaps I start on perhaps my instrument starts on D and goes up to D, right? So here we have D4 going up to D5. If that's the instrument I built, then I can actually play O Susanna in that range, but I would have to transpose O Susanna upper note. So I'd have to go, C would have to go up to D, D would have to go up to E. So we'd actually transpose. And so forth. Yeah, so you'd have to transpose it from the key of C to the key of D. So again, it's implied, but again, all these pieces can be played in the single interval that you're building, the single octave chromatic octave that you're building for your instrument, but you would have to transpose the pieces so they all effectively are within that same range, or whatever range you choose for your instrument, which has a starting note starting from F2 to C4.
So this is another reason to bring your music, because you will have transposed it, the students will have transposed it and will want to be playing from that. It's another reason why the event supervisor can't just hand music to the kids. It wouldn't even be in the right key.
It could be different for every. It could be different for every
Right.
team, right? So the
We do have another question.
sure, fire away.
Do you get extra points for playing extra notes?
No.
There's no mechanism for it in the rules. And in fact, you have to transpose, if I recall correctly from the rules, I think you have to play the excerpt in your chosen octave.
Yes.
So even if you have the ability to play, even if you have the ability to play other notes, it needs to be transposed and played in the chosen octave,
right.
even if you can.
Yeah.
Can we print out our transposed song and play from that at the event? That's what I was just saying. Yes, the kids should do that and bring the music, please.
Yes.
All right. So what other ways? We're running shy on time here. So what other ways do people mess this up?
Okay. You need to tell the event super what is your starting note. What is the starting note of your instrument? The event supervisor can probably deduce it, but it's the team's job to tell us whether it's. They can't just say it's F. We don't know which. We can guess which F it is, but they have to tell us whether it's F2 or F3 or C4. They have to know the octave, they have to know the number, and they have to know the starting note, because everything depends on that. If they tell us F2 and it's really F3, we're going to set up the pitch tool for F2, and essentially all the marks will be for naught because it'll be measured against the scale which is starting on F3. So they have to know the starting note. Again, I would encourage them to write it on the instrument or write it on their log so they know exactly what is the note and which octave it's on. Certainly knowing the chromatic scale and what are the different parts of the chromatic scales, and numbering your chromatic scales. So when the event supervisor tells you these are the numbers of the notes that they would like to hear, that it's easy for you to work out what those notes are. I'm not sure if I gave you the actual musical notes, it would be, I would have to keep on transposing every time for every single team. I'm just going to give numbers. I'm just going to say I want the first note, which is the tonic, and then I want notes 3, 4, 7, 9, 10, and 11, or something like that. And you would have to be able to, and I know what I want to listen for, and you're going to have to provide that. And I'll probably have it written down so people know. I'll try and make it as easy as possible. For instruments, sometimes people have made them so they're not loud enough or they don't vibrate enough. So so everybody can hear the notes, but the software cannot pick it up in the microphone. Either that's because it's not vibrating enough, it's not loud enough, or it can't make an actual waveform. So it can't distinguish. So the software can't pick it up as a musical note. The note, we can pick it up by our ear, but the note is either too dull or it's not forming enough of a musical waveform to be distinguished by the software as a musical note. So again, you wanted to kind of ring clearly and have a nice kind of clear note. We've said this a couple of times already. The log should be easy marks for everybody, right? So that's 10% of the marks. If everybody had a log and they followed the rules, they should be able to easily get 10% of the marks for their chosen instruments. The number of time people have, occasionally we've seen people who had logs but forgot to bring them, or they made a log the night before or literally an hour before the event, so it's incomplete. It should be something which, if you follow the rules ahead of time and you know your instrument, you should be able to fill out each of the different sections that the logs require and get your full 10 marks, an easy 10 marks, right? It should be an easy 10 marks. And also the logs should be helpful to you. They should help you with your instrument and help you, succeed in the event. Again, if you bring an instrument, sometimes I've heard people say that they didn't bring the instrument because perhaps there was an accident the night before and they couldn't play all the notes. I would still bring the instrument. You'll get marks for the notes that you can play, right? If you can't play all the notes of the chromatic scale, perhaps you can play half of them and you'll get credit for those. Perhaps you will get some credit for the song for the bits that you can play. I would say don't give up. If you've put a lot of effort into your musical instruments, things happen. Sometimes at the day of the tournament you drop it or something like that, and things get all out of whack. don't be despondent. You'll probably get, you will, you know, for the notes which are still working, you will get some marks for them. So I would, and that may be better than somebody whose instrument doesn't work at all, right? So I would still encourage you to do that. Also, you know, building your instrument so it's easy to play the song so that you can move between notes relatively easily. I mean, if it's hard to do that, it's going to be very hard to play the songs. And again, occasionally, the last bit of advice is make sure you're not using commercial parts of instruments, you know, except for the strings or rosin, as we previously mentioned. So
I want to backtrack to that to point you went by quickly. I know we're trying to wrap up here, but there is a time score on the song. And the idea behind that is because you're actually supposed to really be able to play the song. And so that means it's not, you know, it's not a race. It's not, the time score is not to see how fast you can play it. It's just to make sure that you can play it in a reasonable time frame, as opposed to somebody who has to rearrange their instrument between every note. That's not really an instrument, right? That's a pitch producer. So that's the purpose of the time score.
And certainly the time limit is always very reasonable for playing the song. I mean, most people should be able to play the song either slowly or at a reasonable speed within the time limit. And it's not meant to be a sort of gotcha. It's meant to be just to kind of, so that you're playing it within a reasonable time frame. And most people, if you sang it that way or whistled that way, you'd easily play the tune within that time interval. So.
Okay, so Andrew, can we have, I think we've covered a lot of it, but are there any bits about what the device testing is going to look like that we haven't? I think we've covered just about everything about what it'll look like on tournament day, or are there some pieces that we still need to discuss?
Well, I can just go very briefly. I know we've mentioned some of this. So the event will probably go as follows if I was running it. Certainly this is not available for viewing of outsiders because we need it to be quiet because we need to test the pitches and everything. I would welcome the team in as they come in. The team would give me a copy of the log. They would keep a copy of their own log. I would tell them what is they would tell me their initial notes. They would tell me it's F4 or C2 or, you know, or sorry, E2 or something like that. I would tell them what are the notes I'm expecting them to play for the chromatic scale. And then we would do a brief check on the size of the instrument. Does it fit in that 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters by 100 centimeters? And we'd have a brief check. We'd have a brief check and look at the instrument. And then I would give the team 2 minutes to actually assemble, tune, and warm up their instruments. Once they've had those 2 minutes, then we would probably briefly ask them, probably for a minute, you know, how did they come up with their design? What was their inspiration? What were the tools they used? What were some of the success things or the things they had to work to get right? I mean, basically, we just want to know that they built their instruments and they understand their instruments and they put it together. Then the event supervisor, myself, will ask them to play their initial note for their chromatic scale.
Actually, I'm going to stop you here because we skipped a step. They have to put away their tuner. So the students can bring a tuner. It can be on their phone even, just for that 2 minute period to make sure they're all set to go, right?
But they can't use it when we're doing the kind of the pitch test or the song test. So they can use it as part of their 2 minutes. Thank you for reminding me on that, Karen. But they will need to put away their tuner when they're actually doing the pitch test and the song test. We will do the pitch test. We'll check the 8 notes that are required. And again, all teams will get the same 8 notes or the same positions on the chromatic scale. And then I will ask them to play the song. And again, I won't be measuring the pitch. I will be listening for the pitch. So for the song, it's not that I will have the pitch tuner and trying to work out whether you're playing the note. I'm interested in the intervals. I'm interested that when you start on your note, you know, I'm expecting to hear the song and the different jumps and then any embellishments to get extra marks. So that's what I'm going to be judging. And that will be the event, and the event will be done as part of the instrument part anyway. So
thank you. We have another question. They want to know, somebody wants to know, will the students get to see when they're doing the pitch testing, will they get to see your pitch testing screen to see how well they're doing?
after they've done it, yes. So I mean, I will show them essentially what we recorded for their pitch test at the end of the day. So,
I think they mean during it though, like while
no,
they're playing
not,
the pitch, will they be able to see?
no. Yeah. So we will measure the 8 pitches, and then after they're done with the pitches, we will sort of turn around the computer and say, you know, here is how well you did. We can't tell you the score at that point, and we wouldn't give you the score because we have to put it into a spreadsheet to actually kind of calculate the score. But you can get a good judge of how close you were to the pitches. I mean, I've done that for the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, basically, we will show you, you know, what we recorded and how well and how close you were to those pitches at the end. But we will not show you while you're doing it. So you can't use you can't use the event supervisor's pitch tool to judge your instruments. No, we can show you at the end. We can show you what you did, how well you did. So.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, if you play a wind instrument, you could, if you had the feedback, you'd be able to alter what you were doing to alter the pitch, which is why the students don't get to see it as they're doing it.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, let's give it a minute and see if we've got any more.
These are all great questions. Thank you. Thank you.
They are, and Andrew, thank you. This is a you know, there's a lot to know in this event. It's not intended to be an expensive event, as Andrew said. You know, which is why extra notes don't get any points. There's no points for how pretty the sound is, right? So you don't need to go out and buy expensive wood, or, you know, we've seen all kinds of interesting instruments
which have done very well. I mean, they've been made up from scrap wood or scrap metal or things around the house and
TDC. I've seen balloon things and just all kinds of things vibrate.
Right.
It
just has to be a clear note to do well, right, and pitched and calibrated so it pitches well. So
yes, testing with the pitch tester is I think our pro tip of the night. Use the pitch tester that Andrew will be using at tournament to judge.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skinner, for your time tonight. This was very informative, knowing what was going to happen. People are saying thank you, and we really appreciate your time. Good luck. We look forward to seeing everybody at tournament and hearing all the instruments, playing all the songs. We should have a little recital.
Yeah, that's the fun thing for me. I enjoy hearing all the instruments. So.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.